Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We have a very large group and are thrilled to discuss this topic with you. This is such an important discussion for supporting the successful literacy development of our students today. And specifically, we're going to discuss how assessing Spanish-speaking students in their native language is central to leveling the playing field and empowering them on their literacy journey. How dual language assessment in both English and Spanish enables teachers to pinpoint where their Spanish-speaking students or emergent bilingual students really are in their skill development, and then what this means for instruction. We are joined today by a very special expert in the field, Dr. Lillian Durán. Dr. Durán is an associate professor at the University of Oregon in the Center on Teaching and Learning. She has conducted and continues to lead research focused on improving the assessment of early language and literacy skills in Spanish-speaking preschoolers, multi-tiered systems of support with dual language learners, development of a Spanish-English supplemental preschool language and literacy curriculum, and the effects of bilingual preschool instruction on language and literacy development, which she's going to talk some about today. So welcome, Lillian. Welcome, Dr. Durán. I am Kajal Patel-Bilo, VP of Spanish Solutions, and I will share a bit about our work on dual language assessment at the end. So I'm thrilled to welcome all of you. And with that, let's jump right in. And I'm going to turn it over to you, Dr. Durán.
All right. Good morning, everybody. So I'm going to introduce myself, and then we'll get into the content. So I'm as Kajal said, I'm an associate professor in special education at the University of Oregon. Prior to pursuing my PhD, I was an early childhood special education teacher. So I've been conducting assessments with young children for a very long time in terms of my career. And now I've just switched tables, and now I'm a developer of assessments. I teach early literacy at the university. It's my specialty. And as I indicated, I develop these assessments, and I particularly focus on Spanish language and literacy development. Now, in my personal background, something to know about me is that I'm first generation born in the United States. My father is from Mexico. Yo puedo hablar español. And my mom is from Germany. She grew up in a small town in Germany, Rüstungen. Und ich kann Deutsch sprechen. So I grew up with Spanish, German, and English in my home. And so this topic of multilingual learners is part of my personal experience as well as a professional interest. So let's talk about equity here for a minute. We don't want equity to turn into a buzzword. There's lots of conversations about equity, but we want our conversations and our approaches to promoting equity to be authentic and meaningful. What's important to understand is that 77% of Latino students are likely not going to be proficient readers by fourth grade. This statistic, taken out of context, you wouldn't want to assume it's because somehow Latino students are not able to read. It really is a systemic issue about our school systems failing them and not providing the supports that they need to be successful readers. Latino students also comprise about 42% of those students served for specific learning disability. Again, this over-identification rate really starts to show a trend in which these students are not getting what they need, they fall behind, and pretty soon they're referred for special education services and end up qualifying under that category of specific learning disability, particularly in the area of reading. So what we can see here by a lack of adequate and effective services and reading instructional supports, it really does start to begin to have long-term impacts on their education and then ultimately their quality of their life outcomes. So when we look at our assessment approaches in your school district, one way that we start this deficit-based thinking and these deficit-based models and going down those trajectories that lead to students' poor outcomes is an approach that where we only assess children in English. If you look at yourselves, those of you on, there's many of you on this webinar today, ask yourselves, are we actually assessing in the child's home language? And if we are not, what are we missing? So here's some data from my preschool studies. I'll tell you more about them later, but basically when we assess these students in phonological awareness skills only in English, 63% fell in that tier 2, tier 3 category, indicating they were at risk or they needed some intensive support. But when we assess the same population in Spanish, these are the same kids, only 21% of that population looked like they needed tier 2, tier 3 support. You can see how our thinking about these students would be very different if we understood, well, they have those skills in Spanish. It's just a matter of building those skills in English versus really thinking that they have a deficit, which could lead us down the road of thinking that they have a delay, that they're having difficulties learning, that somehow their families haven't been working with them, when all of this is untrue. And what we need to do is really assess these children in the language they know best. So the agenda for today is we're going to talk about the critical need to universally assess bilingual Spanish-speaking students so that we can conduct high quality and accurate universal screening. I'm going to talk about the key features of instructionally relevant Spanish literacy assessments. So what should we measure in Spanish? Is it the same as English, different than English? And then how do we use that information? And then we'll talk about the latest research-based Spanish literacy assessment and some options out there for you to use. So first, we're going to talk about the critical need for some of the areas that we need to consider when we are assessing Spanish-English bilingual students. So number one, we need to think about home language exposure. So young bilinguals, this is one way that they're different, is we really need to think about how much Spanish and English are children exposed to at home. That will give us an idea of the quantity across both languages, the percentages of time they're spending in both languages. You should be using home language surveys that have families complete some information about how often Spanish is used, how often English is used. Is it about 50-50? Is it more Spanish? Is it more English? And then this gives us an idea of how we would assume or how we would think children would perform in each language based on their exposure. Then we need to think about the language used in instruction. We know that home language performance, that there are differences between our simultaneous and our sequential bilinguals. Simultaneous bilinguals, meaning those children who speak 2 or more languages from birth. Sequential bilinguals, meaning those children who are primarily speaking one home language, in this case Spanish, and gaining English as they enter one of our preschool or kindergarten programs. Then they get into our programs and then they're bombarded with the language of instruction. It could be English only, or it could be some form of dual language instruction. When it's English only, what we know from research is that their Spanish over the year either begins to plateau or actually decrease over time, given the rapid increase in exposure and the expectation to communicate in English. If they are in dual language programs, you'll see more equitable growth or equal growth across Spanish and English because both are being supported. Now, this may seem like common sense as I'm saying this out loud, but what's important then to take that information and think about then your students' performance over time, not only at beginning of the year for universal screening, but if you're engaged in these 3 seasonal windows, what winter and spring might look like based on language of instruction and the changes you might see in the balances between the 2 languages. Then there are issues of cross-linguistic transfer, an exciting and important nuance of the different, of the relationship between Spanish and English is that they share a lot of the same letter names, letter sounds, there's cognates that are shared. And so we find correlations between development in Spanish and English. We also can predict children's later reading performance by their early scores in Spanish and phonological awareness and letter knowledge and language development. And so it's really important that we not only think about relationships between Spanish to Spanish and measuring Spanish only in the utility of seeing their outcomes in Spanish reading, but understanding that early on, if children are more dominant in Spanish, we can use those scores to predict their later English reading outcomes. So I'm going to talk to you now about studies I've conducted with bilingual Spanish-speaking preschoolers. That's been my primary work, but also I've obviously worked with Amplify to develop the K-8 measures. And I'm now currently working with the state of California on developing measures for the state for dyslexia screening. So certainly my work has branched into this K-8 arena, but I'd like to go back to my preschool studies just because we had large sample sizes and years of data. We've done longitudinal studies. And so there's a lot for us to learn about that early development and how that carries on through school age. So in this particular study, We looked at the identification of risk based on language of assessment. So those of you who are familiar with multi-tiered systems of support, or MTSS as we call it, are familiar with these tiers. Tier 1 being just fine, Tier 2 meaning there's some risk, a need for additional support, and Tier 3 meaning that there is need for more intensive and potentially individualized support. So we're going to, the purpose of the study was to explore a risk designation on the sample of children, whether we assess them in English or Spanish. All right, so in this study, there were 214 students or children out of 800. And these particular students, they both had full data sets. And so that's why we winnowed down to the 214, because we're talking about the exact same population of children. The participants were from California, Oregon, Utah, and Minnesota. All were enrolled in Head Start programs. And then I already indicated it's only students with complete data sets. So our findings here, now we're talking about vocabulary. We're just going to focus on this area. We have a picture naming task, which is a task just like it sounds. They have to name the pictures in the deck. And when we administered the assessment to the same population of kids for balanced bilinguals, so we also disaggregated the data by those kids who are speaking Spanish and English at home versus those that are primarily speaking Spanish and are Spanish dominant. This slide is about our balanced bilinguals. 78% of them in English appeared to qualify for Tier 2, Tier 3 supports, again showing that risk or even the need for more intensive intervention. And these are children, remember, that are speaking both Spanish and English at home. So one might assume, well, we could just assess them in English and get valid results. But look at what we find when we measure them in Spanish. 30% are in Tier 1 and only 40% are in that Tier 2, Tier 3 designation. It's nearly half as many when we measured them only in English. So you could see, even with our balanced bilinguals, we would over-identify risk if we only measured them in English. We need to really look across both languages to understand their ability level overall. All right, so let's look at the next one, Spanish dominant. So when our Spanish dominant population, the differences are even more pronounced. And again, it's common sense. These kids primarily speak Spanish. You assess them in English, 94% of them look like they need Tier 2 or Tier 3 support. When assessed in Spanish, that's only 18%. It's less than half. Again, you can see when we're thinking about equity, we're thinking about asset-based models, we need to understand that these children are coming into our programs with skills. They're coming into our programs with phonological awareness abilities, vocabulary, but we need to measure it in a language that they understand and know best so that they can demonstrate their best performance, and we're actually able to understand their ability level without underestimating it. So some future directions, we really need to acknowledge the limitations of English-only assessment. We continue down this path as if it somehow is the only way it can relate to our English instruction. Maybe we haven't gone through the work of finding the Spanish language assessments we can use. There are folks that might have their philosophical reasons for not assessing in Spanish, but ultimately, technically, in evidence-based practices, and if you're interested in implementing those, we need to start looking at their Spanish language abilities side by side with their English language abilities and early literacy abilities to have a more complete picture and to design more effective instruction for this population. If what we were doing was working, we wouldn't see those abysmal outcomes across the nation for our English learners and our Latino students. We also need to think about home and school language exposure, so get more sensitive about having families complete questionnaires that give us more information than, do you speak a language other than English at home? What is it? Check the box. We need more nuanced and specific information about how much, and percentages, a balance between both, who's speaking those languages with those children, and at what age was English introduced. And then as they come into our school systems and our programs, thinking about how is the language of instruction affecting their trajectory of development in that particular language. So even if you engage in Spanish language assessment and all your intervention is English, you might see those kids plateau or decrease over time. And that doesn't necessarily mean that they're having a delay or a language learning issue, as long as their English is increasing over time. If they're in dual language programs, you would expect growth that's more on parity and equal between the two languages. So now we need to think about, the critical need to universally assess bilingual Spanish speaking students. Number one, we want to avoid underestimating their ability level, which I indicated. We need to understand how Spanish scores and early literacy performance can help us predict their performance in English. Basically, if they're demonstrating the ability to learn their knowledge of these skills, we can use that and leverage their knowledge in Spanish to support their English development, especially in the area of cognates. You could focus, for instance, cognates in vocabulary learning. And cognates are words that sound the same between the two languages and also have the same meaning, such as elephant and elefante. Spanish reading skills are an asset that influence reading development because there's so much shared between the languages. Teaching a child to read in Spanish that has a shallow orthography, meaning there's a high, the letter sound correspondence is more one-to-one than certainly than English, with all of our difficult and opaque constructions such as the OUGHs of the world. And so learning how to read in Spanish is actually a lot easier than learning how to read in English. And if you do have the opportunity and are running dual language programs, you are supporting reading development overall when you're able to teach reading in Spanish as well as English. And then, of course, we want to honor heritage language, heritage culture. Language and culture are inextricably linked. We want these kids to maintain their Spanish and their cultural identities, to be able to communicate with their families, feel pride about their heritage, as well as stay connected to their communities and extended families. So here are some key features of instructionally relevant Spanish literacy assessments. So what I'm going to tell you here is probably going to be no surprise to any of you who are super interested in language and literacy development. We're going to focus on critical early literacy skills. What was mentioned in the National Early Literacy Panel applies by and large for Spanish as well, just with more of a focus on that language development. So we want to look at letter names, phonological awareness, letter names and letter sounds, I should say, the two of those, so alphabet knowledge, phonological awareness, alphabetic principle, fluency and accuracy, vocabulary, and reading comprehension. Again, nothing here is rocket science or is out of our wheelhouse for what we've been doing for decades in terms of measurement. But what we do need to think about, importantly, is how do these skills develop in Spanish? Of course, Spanish has a slightly different alphabet. Phonological awareness might be best accomplished both at the syllable level and phoneme level. So for instance, first sounds in our preschool measure has first sounds, but also first syllable recognition, given the syntax and the structure of Spanish. We also want to, so we're attending to specific linguistic features, thinking about the letter sound combinations that are unique to Spanish. And also the passages that we've designed for oral reading fluency are reflective of the syntactical, lexical, and grammatical rules, with the passages being leveled in terms of their difficulty based on Spanish performance and how Spanish develops. We've also had native and bilingual and bicultural authors develop our new passages. Of course, our Spanish measure, we wanted to have strong technical adequacy. And as someone who develops assessment, this is one of my pet peeves in the market. I encourage you, if you are using a Spanish assessment right now, to ask for the technical manual. And there should be one provided to you to see whether or not the assessment has appropriate reliability. Have they done criterion validity studies? Have they looked at their classification accuracy, meaning their sensitivity and specificity of their instrument? And is it generalizable to your population? Some instruments out there, such as the TVIP, were normed decades ago on populations in Mexico. So they're inappropriate for use with our Spanish-English bilinguals in the United States. As I write about this topic and work on this topic and work on designing these technically adequate measures, I just want to point out that many companies, unfortunately, will invest heavily in their English measures, but their Spanish measures will be an afterthought and will have smaller sample sizes, less psychometric rigor. They may not even publish the technical manuals. And why? Why would that be the case when essentially you need to have confidence in the findings that you're gaining from these measures? So you want to be sure when you're choosing a Spanish measure that you're confident in its ability to accurately reflect that child's ability in Spanish. And then we need to think about the appropriateness of the tasks. So thinking about, are they age appropriate? So for instance, in the new mCLASS Lectura, I designed a measure called que inicio. Inicio means beginnings, with the understanding that many children enter kindergarten and may not be quite ready yet for letter names or phonological awareness tasks that aren't scaffolded. So in the que inicio series, those tasks are receptive, they're scaffolded with images, and children have a higher likelihood of being able to demonstrate their emerging early literacy skills. It needs to be reflective of the skill being assessed. So for instance, I brought up the issues around phonological awareness and looking at syllable and phoneme level in Spanish. And then they need to be efficient, transparent, and have high utility. We want each test to be brief, less than 3 minutes. We want to have standardized procedures for administration, so there's high fidelity in the administration of the assessment. Of course, any assessor for Spanish language should have high levels of proficiency and either be native speakers or native-like speakers. And of course, we need to have clear scoring guidelines for the assessments so that it's clear whether the response is correct or incorrect, again, so that we reduce the amount of error in our measurement. We want these to be teacher administered. Our belief is that teachers need to be present during the assessment, and the assessment should not be all automated, because teachers gain incredibly valuable information to witness how children and observe how children engage with those testing items. How are they responding? What are they understanding during their response? What is their engagement level during these testing items, so that they learn more about their approach to the items as well as their response to the items. And that's very instructive for teachers when they're designing instruction. We want the data to be instructionally relevant and the reporting to be instructionally relevant. We want to make sure that the data then leads directly to, well, what should I do? What should I work on? And so the kinds of skills that we're assessing directly lead to those instructional approaches and instructional decision-making. And of course, we want data to be trusted by teachers. We had our measures reviewed and vetted by teachers. We listened carefully to requests of teachers for how we revised our measures and developed new measures. And so, of course, we always want to be in this conversation with the folks who will actually be using this and making it meaningful and actually implementing this in the field. So here's an example for direct connection to instruction. Here's a case study about Gabriel. Is strong in PA in Spanish and needs to build PA skills in English. So here's some of the scores. We will have a dual language scoring system that will present children's scores side by side between English and Spanish, so that you can really understand their profile. Young bilinguals are not two monolinguals. Young bilinguals have this language system that is comprised of both languages. And so you will see strengths and weaknesses in different areas across those languages based on the context they're learning those skills and how they're utilizing both of their language skills together in order to respond and in their learning. And so these assets for cross-linguistic transfer can drive instruction. So native language skills can lead to strong support in both languages. And of course, dual instructional models vary, as we indicated. We can have dual language two-way. We have dual language one-way, maintenance bilingual, transitional bilingual, English immersion. Whatever model you're learning, the take-home message from my portion of this webinar today is to really emphasize the need to assess children in both languages and to understand how to interpret their performance in both languages, and then how to take that information to make instructionally relevant and meaningful decisions to improve outcomes.
So hello again, I'm Kajal. So thank you so much, Dr. Durán, for taking us through that insightful and useful guidance on the importance and role of dual language assessment. So jumping off from there, how do we achieve that? How can we make it easier for teachers to assess Spanish and dual language students and plan the instruction that they need? So we are excited at Amplify to serve educators with a new dual language solution that will do just that and meet long-standing gaps that we have heard from educators. mCLASS Lectura will launch for Back to School 2022. It is a research-based assessment with instruction, And we brought together a team of nationally recognized experts. You will recognize one of them, Dr. Durán, to work with our literacy learning scientists. We collaborated with also Dr. Doris Baker, Dr. Gisela O'Brien, Dr. Elsa Cardenas Hagen, and we also brought in teachers and instructional leaders from several school districts who are on the ground working with students every day and have the needs firsthand. And as a result of our collaboration and all of that input gathered, we have mCLASS Lectura, a universal screener co-developed with the Center on Teaching and Learning at the University of Oregon and validated in partnership with Dr. Durán. So we'll drill into the assessment in just a moment, but want to go back to some of the ideas that Dr. Durán talked about. So what are the skill areas that students are proficient in their native language, and how can we build on those strengths, which are an asset, and make connections to the second language? And those native skills and second language skills, like Dr. Durán described, are not existing in two monolinguals within one person. They are existing together and are intertwined. And so let's take a look at that. Here are two example students, two example dual language profiles. And Gabrielle and Alyssa here, they represent just two of many profiles. Their assessment data gives us information, and that information will help teachers drive instruction. So Gabrielle is strong in phonological awareness in Spanish and needs to build those skills in English. Instruction for him can build on sounds that are similar across languages, as well as highlight the sounds that are different in either language. It's recommended that Gabrielle work on syllables before moving to phonemes. Alyssa demonstrates higher phonological awareness and decoding skills in English than she does in Spanish. And so during Spanish literacy instruction, Alyssa can focus on sounds and letter correspondences that are unique to Spanish, practicing at both the syllable and the phoneme levels. So imagine having that information at your fingertips in one view. And here is such a view. It's small. I'm going to go through it in more detail. This is the mCLASS Dual Language Report, and it provides a side-by-side view of Gabrielle's reading skills in English and Spanish and provides observations and guidance for instruction. So let's focus in on the middle section here, which is we see skill by skill, side by side, how Gabrielle is performing in both English and Spanish. And we already noted that Gabrielle is at benchmark in many Spanish skills, and that's an asset that can be applied to his English development. If this was Alyssa, we may see more green in Spanish and green in English and more red and yellow in Spanish. And by the way, a teacher can still look at a student's data in just English or just in Spanish. With this additional view, we have a picture of how those skills compare by language. And not only that, teachers can begin to understand what that means and what to do. So based on Gabrielle's assessment, the teacher receives guidance on where to capitalize on cross-linguistic transfer. So specifically for Gabrielle, in guidance is given in phonological awareness in letter sounds and decoding. And so how does one follow that guidance? First of all, there's a description at the top, and along with a document that provides specific strategies and tips to the teacher that the teacher can embed in their instruction for that particular skill. And this is all right at the teacher's fingertips. So let's take a step back and think about the Spanish assessment that drives such rich information for teachers. Teachers have been asking for the right Spanish assessment to help their Spanish-speaking students for a long time. They want parity with English solutions, whereas Spanish assessment is not an afterthought. They want the content and word choice to be more culturally responsive, meaning the passage needs to reflect the student's background and experiences. And they want research-backed measures. Dr. Durán talked about that, not a translation, but rigorous research-backed measures that are rigorously tested. And they want a unified representation of their students' biliteracy skills, which we just saw. So Lectura is designed from the ground up based on the latest research to reflect how students learn to read in Spanish. We have 3 years of active research and development invested, and that is going to continue. We have parity with the English assessment for those of you that are familiar with DIBELS 8th edition in terms of the user experience and in the instructional tools, and the grade coverage being case 6. And the content drives instructional decisions for Spanish literacy. And when it is paired with DIBELS 8th edition, there is then the dual language reporting and instruction that we just saw. The assessment was authentically written by native Spanish speakers. The authors, and in particular, I'm going to talk about the passages, but the authors of all the content represent the diversity of Spanish coming from Mexico, Central America, South America, and the Caribbean. The Spanish spoken by students in the US comes from many different places, and we really strive to ensure that our content represented that. Our authors wrote culturally relevant texts and passages. And here's an example of a particular oral reading fluency passage, La Feria de California, where Ana goes to the fair with her parents. They watch and they join in salsa dancing. Other topics include a market in Oaxaca, a spinning game called trompos that is played in Chile and Mexico. I just read one the other day about 2 long lost friends from Guatemala that met back up in Texas at a restaurant. And our expert and focus groups also then reviewed these passages as well for content bias, equity, and usability. And in addition to that, all the measures, including these passages, are field tested with students all across the country, not just in a couple of particular states, but all across the country. So how does Lectura, excuse me, how does Lectura reflect Spanish literacy acquisition? So Dr. Durán already talked about some of this, about the appropriateness of the measures. She talked about the early developmental focus and the K inicio measures that are sensitive enough to measure skills and see what the students can do, even if maybe they are not able to do the tasks at the exact kindergarten level. She also talked about phonological awareness, measuring at the syllable and phoneme levels. And in addition to that, we also included greater variety and increasingly complex multisyllabic words because of the more shallow orthography in Spanish, where students are able to begin decoding earlier, longer words earlier. And so we included those words earlier so that we give the students an opportunity to demonstrate what they can do, and we can learn from how they are decoding those longer words. And finally, with decoding specifically, we are measuring letter sound correspondence as well as letter names, and we are also measuring word level reading, which has greater face validity than the nonsense word reading. Nonsense word reading is still a useful measure. The research on it is not as strong as it is with real word reading at this moment in Spanish, and so we went with word level reading in Spanish. And so how is all of that done? It is done one-on-one. Dr. Durán talked about the importance of observational assessment. If you're familiar with DIBELS 8th edition, you know how this is done. It is teacher administered and digitally scored, a one-on-one environment between the teacher and the student where they're sitting together. Here you see Lisette sitting with her teacher. The teacher has a device to document what exactly Lisette is responding with through a series of 1-minute measures. It's gentle on the student. From Lisette's perspective, she's just getting some special one-on-one time with her teacher and doing an activity. And it's gentle on the teacher, of course, too, because then they get to see their students producing skills. This is what it looks like for the teacher and the student. It's the same experience with DIBELS 8th edition. The teacher has a touch device, and depending upon the measure, the student may have a printed page of materials in front of them. In this particular image on the left, the teacher has an iPad and is listening for syllable segmentation. So in this case, the student wouldn't have materials in front of them. They're listening to the word and they're orally producing the response. They're segmenting the word into syllables. And on the right, we see printed materials the student has in front of them for syllable sounds and oral reading fluency. So Lectura brings the parity to English assessment that biliteracy educators have been asking for and expect. We discussed how Lectura measures reflect Spanish literacy development. We talked about the mode of assessment, how it is gentle on students and easy for teachers. And we also talked about how instructional tools are provided. We have the dual language report. We also have instructional grouping and activities that are provided in both English and in Spanish for students. And so I'd like to conclude by returning to the population of students that we're serving. We have a large and growing population of Spanish speakers, and we even have some native English speakers who are learning Spanish in our dual language programs. And when we bring together DIBEL's 8th edition with Lectura to serve these students and their teachers, we've recognized that language, that particularly the Spanish language of these students, is fundamentally an asset. We're able to identify the skills that each child is bringing, and we're able to provide instruction for each language to amplify biliteracy and opportunity. So I'm going to pause there and spend some time with Dr. Durán on questions that you have. I will share that we do have a white paper available on our website written by Dr. Durán called The Importance of Dual Language Assessment in Early Literacy. You can also learn more about the program by emailing us and calling that number. But let's take some of your questions. I have one here already. How do you choose which language then, right? We have English assessment, Spanish assessment, only so much time in the day. How do we know which language to assess in?
All right, great. Well, I'll take that one on here. So thinking through language of assessment is an important topic. Of course, the recommendation is to do your best to assess in both languages and to consider how the child might perform in both languages. Over time, there is some, conversation that needs to be had about language of instruction. So for instance, right when the child enters kindergarten, the utility of measuring in both languages is really apparent. They've been exposed to Spanish at home primarily. They're entering these English only classrooms. You need to know where they are in both. As they proceed through the grades, say they've had English only instruction, it's first grade, then you can start to see, well, does the child actually have those skills in Spanish? Have they been maintained in Spanish? Or is the child's performance in English more predictive and more reflective of the instruction they've been receiving in English? So the answer to that question is a bit nuanced, and you really have to go back to thinking about what is the purpose of this assessment and what has been the language of instruction, and how would I think that this child would perform in both languages?
Thank you.
Also, I have a number of questions that I can read out from the chat.
Oh, perfect.
If that's helpful.
Yes.
So here's just one. As a dual immersion school in our district, we are currently part of the pilot study with Spanish mCLASS. Is mCLASS Lectura the same thing, or is this geared more towards native speakers? Well, the answer is yes, right?
It is the same thing. So first of all, I want to thank you for participating in the pilot. The study is so important to our assessment. And yes, mCLASS Lectura is the final version of that. We had not named it at the time that we begun our study.
So speaking of pilot, we've gotten some questions around that. Is there any opportunity to pilot mCLASS Lectura this school year? In their school, they are currently using EDEL and DIBELS. Just curious about what that could look like.
So that depends. I would encourage you to get in touch with us and we can talk more about that. We are currently accepting folks into the pilot under some certain special circumstances, and we will actually be looking for more folks to work with for some additional measures. So get in touch with us. I think there are some opportunities, and it just depends on your school and your population.
Great. For how long do you do dual language benchmark assessments? Is there a certain grade range? What is that?
Yeah, so the grade range is right now all the way K through 8. And again, I think this really takes some questioning on your programs, part of your program. I mean, benchmarking in both languages lets you know how each language is developing and gives you valuable information about both languages. But for instance, say oral reading fluency. If the child was never instructed to read in Spanish, you wouldn't assume that they would suddenly be able to read in Spanish, right? So we have to think about how is your language of instruction impacting their ability level. Even for English speaking children, unless they were in an English speaking reading course or reading instruction, they wouldn't just naturally learn how to read in English and progress in those skills. So if your language of instruction is a dual language approach, kids are learning how literacy skills in both languages, then of course you want to maintain that dual language measurement system all the way through the grades. If you have an English only approach, you might start to pick and choose what makes sense to measure in Spanish over time, particularly if you're seeing in your school that that skills are plateauing or decreasing over time, simply as an artifact of the fact that you're only providing instruction in English.
We have another question. How long exactly do these assessments take?
So most of them are like 3 minutes or less. That's the idea. The English assessments are 1 minute, but Spanish has multisyllabic words. It just takes longer to say them. We have a measure called elision, which is where you remove sounds from words. So the examiner instructions take a bit more time. And so they vary, but we're keeping them at 3 minutes or less, but we did some empirical analyses to see at what point do we achieve the most accurate information as we look at that assessment window.
Dr. Durán or Kajal, are there resources either of you could suggest for assessing students whose second language is other than Spanish?
That's an excellent question, and I wish I had a silver bullet for you. I wish I had the answer that was just like wrapped up nice and tidy. So here's some responses I'm going to provide for that. In that case, if you're not providing instruction in that language, I'm right here in California, so let's use Vietnamese as an example, then you would want to carefully look at that child's English scores and think about how Vietnamese might impact their English development. Maybe do more interviewing of families. Do they think their language is typical for a child their age? Are they progressing in their skills at home? But really for those populations at this point, we don't have screening measures we can use that are valid and reliable. You could do your best with English and understanding where they are in English and then targeting your instruction to their level of English ability and English proficiency, and then try to find these outside sources that are more valid around their home language development and including their families in that discussion about their performance in their home language and growth in their home language, and encouraging the family to maintain the development of that language.
If mCLASS Lectura is a screener, how do we get diagnostic information? Or would teachers need to dig deeper with another assessment to diagnose?
Yes, absolutely. These are not diagnostic measures. They do not diagnose learning disability or reading disability. What they really look at is risk. So again, we go back to that multi-tiered systems of support model. It's a preventative measure to identify risk early on so that children don't fall so far behind that they end up qualifying for special education services. The idea here is that you flag those children early on, you identify them early on as having potentially tier 2 or tier 3 instructional needs, meaning that the child is not tier 2, but their instructional needs are tier 2 or tier 3. And they can fluidly move between tiers. You can offer tier 2 support, and guess what? It worked. And then they screen them in, say, winter, and now they're functioning more at a tier 1 level. So the idea here is you provide screening, it's preventative, you offer additional instruction in order to remediate the issue early on. And that's how early identification and early intervention work hand in hand to prevent reading failure.
Kajal, I think this one is more for you. If we currently have DIBELS, EDEL, will mCLASS be updated and or replaced with Lectura, or is it a separate assessment?
So for our districts that are using already the EDEL assessment, you will be hearing from us soon, if you haven't already, about transitioning. It's not an additional thing, it will replace. It is, you can transition from EDEL to Lectura, and we're encouraging our districts to do that for the 22-23 school year. And we'll make it easier for you.
Does mCLASS Lectura screen for dyslexia?
We're working on the psychometrics of that and doing some predictive validity to measures that diagnose dyslexia. And so that is the goal down the road, but we haven't quite done those analyses yet.
And that I was just going to add that validation is being completed this year. So for the 22-23 school year, it is validated. It would be validated for dyslexia screening.
Great. Sorry for cutting you off there, Kajal.
No.
And how much would a site license cost for mCLASS Lectura?
So I would encourage you to get in touch with your rep and we can talk to you about that. I will say that it is comparable to what you have now.
Yes,
and if you are using EDEL, I'm sorry, if you are using EDEL, I apologize that the transition would be very easy for you. And then we can talk, our rep can talk to you about pricing. Please reach out. Yeah.
And I just put into the chat once more a link to the mCLASS Lectura website where there's a button right on there to get in touch with a rep.
Yep. And then EDEL, someone asked, what is EDEL? EDEL is the Spanish version of the DIBELS, the early version of the DIBELS. And now it's been completely re-envisioned as the mCLASS Lectura.
Okay, so I think we've gotten to most of the questions here. Okay, we have one more here. Do you have a map of which screeners to use when and at what grades? Perhaps like a flow chart?
Yes, we will have that. I'm assuming you're talking about which measures in mCLASS Lectura. And if so, yes, that will be provided because those measures will be what drive the composite score. And there will also be guidance. If you are familiar with DIBELS 8th edition, you know that there is some guidance provided based on the student's performance on another measure of an alternate measure that you could do or not do. And so that will also exist in mCLASS Lectura.
Great. Well, I think we got through all the questions. We're just seeing if we missed any. If not, we can give people 15 minutes back on their day. Yeah, I think that's it. Kajal, Lillian, is there anything else you want to say before we head out here?
Just thank you so much for your attention to this. I always appreciate, and folks out there in the school districts and in programs that are really trying to sort out these issues and to improve the outcomes of our Spanish-speaking Latino students, and looking at assessment approaches that will really map onto their ability levels and help us to really understand their strengths so that we can build on those and improve those reading outcomes.
Yes, thank you again, everyone, for joining us. And on your screen now, you should see information on a couple of other upcoming webinars that we have. So please join us if you can. The latest on actually, that was yesterday, I apologize. So sorry about that. But there is another one coming next week, the science of reading and dyslexia support. And we have other webinars. If you go to our website, you will see a longer list there. So please join us. Thank you so much.
Yep. Thank you.